Hey, welcome to today's show. Today, got a good friend of ours, James Paterson, and I won't say his business. Cause I'll let him say it because I'll probably mix up which one it is. But James, former professional rugby player, played in New Zealand, played for the Eagles, and now an entrepreneur in the agricultural business, homesteading in Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri. I don't know. We'll have to find out which one. Welcome to the show, James.
Thanks. Really appreciate talking to you guys. Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, I guess where would I live? For a while I couldn't figure out why I wasn't getting my packages here, and I just assumed Kansas City was, one area. And I actually live in Leawood, which is actually its own town south of Kansas City, Kansas. But I just addressed all my mail as Kansas City, and nothing ever came to me. So I quickly learned my lesson. So I think it took me 8 or 9 months to realize that it was two states as well, and that the river split them. But I think now I've got my Midwest geography kind of pinpointed down.
Well, there you go. Well, there's not a mountain range to use as a
I
handle,
know.
right?
Yeah.
Coloradans are always spoiled with that.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, they
no
are.
doubt about
Very
it.
much so.
Well, hey, James, what I'd love to do is, so really unique career in the way that you got into professional rugby. But what I'm really interested in is now that you've been in business for 6 years, I think. How is that rugby life experience helped you in the business world?
It's interesting. So I had in fact, it was St. Paddy's Day over a few Guinnesses the other day. I had a conversation with a guy exactly around this, and I talked about how rugby probably has helped transition into the business world and some of the challenges around that. So it wasn't all smooth, as you know, when you're trying to become a professional athlete, or you're a professional athlete, you have the work ethic. So I think that's something that intrinsically is part of it, and your position doesn't exist if you're not willing to work harder than anyone else around you. So you have that bit. So you have the work ethic that's kind of driven into you. You also have the team sport and the team environment
Mhm.
around, you know, it's not just you, you're part of a system. The system only operates and you achieve your goals if everybody works towards a common goal and they work together to do that. So rugby gives you that. The one thing rugby doesn't give you, and especially in the sales world, is an appreciation on how to understand failure and how to use failure to motivate you in the right way, and rather than using failure as fear based. Because
Hmm.
as a professional athlete, the one thing that you can't have happen is failure. Failure on a small level is fine. In a game, you learn how to take a mistake you make and brush it off your shoulder. We worked with psychologists at the time, and they would give us a cue. My cue was I brushed my shoulder, and that was my cue that I could push past that mistake and focus on the next task at
I
hand.
saw you do that a lot in the games. I always wondered why you did that. You were always
Because I was making so many mistakes, or because I was just brushing my shoulders. Um, yeah, I think that's one thing. But when I went into sales, I just got beat up, and I couldn't get past that point. And it was almost to the point where it was really inhibiting my ability to even be able to succeed, because to me a no was an absolute no. And I'd grown up, and for 8 years, that was how I deal with things. And I never dealt with failure or bad performances that well compared to other people, because I took it personally, because, it was everything to me. It was my career. It was my dream. And so when things happened, that was one of the things that maybe perhaps limited my success in rugby a little bit, but it was also something I had to get over. So coming into sales, that was, one of the things that I found the most difficult is how do you look at a no in a way like, a no is a positive, in terms of it's you're further along the process of learning more about your product, learning more about your approach, learning more about what the market needs. You need to be able to hear these no's to be able to understand how to gain a yes. And initially, I would say that was probably one of the hardest things. So, there was both positives that came out of the experience of being a professional athlete. There were some limitations that I found that kind of transferred across, and those are some of the big hurdles that I had to try and overcome.
Right. And I'd say that that attitude towards failure, it from sports kind of carries over into the business world a lot, especially if you're an entrepreneur, not just sales, but more specifically as an entrepreneur, because, like you said, it was my dream. And when your dream is your business and you're going out and selling your business all the time and people don't want
Yeah.
to buy your business, people don't want to buy your dream. Oh, that's not a good feeling at all.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And, I think you can always look at examples across the board of people in different segments of or success stories of different entrepreneurs, and I think they all have one common thing in failure. They all learn how to use the fear of failure or failure itself to motivate themselves to be successful in the future.
It's funny because in the military, failure was that evil word also because, if you went to the school and had to go through like some of the stuff that I did, you go through the selection process and these tests, and if you failed, then you don't get that opportunity. You don't get to do that. So, I go on a real quick little thing that I'm doing right now is I'm shifting it because I worked in the entrepreneur space, coaching guys, the fail fast, fail forward, fail often. And I was like, man, I hate that freaking word.
Yeah.
I just hate it. So I started calling it misses. And
Yeah.
with a miss, I can adjust my target. I can adjust my aim point. And a failure, I'm, just like a professional athlete, that word is just, I mean, it hurts. So yeah, I see where you're coming from. So, but what have you done? I mean, are you still dusting off your shoulder after a sales call that doesn't go
Uh,
well, or what?
I'm not sure if I, I'm not sure if I do that. And maybe I should go back towards doing that. I think, I think the biggest thing that I had to get over and learn for myself is I almost had to I wouldn't say give up, but I would say not really don't concern myself with the outcome, become more process orientated. So, and it's something that I, should have thought back to rugby because it's all around the processes. You train all the processes. And I think one thing I didn't do is I didn't train any of the processes in the business world. So they weren't intrinsic to me. In rugby, I trained all of the processes leading up to something. For example, catching a high ball, I would, follow my certain steps. I would go through things so that when I got into the situation, it would just happen naturally. And it wasn't something I had to think about in terms of getting towards the outcome. And I think I had to do the same thing in business. So I had to focus on the processes a little bit and then just not worry about the outcome as much, because one takes care of the other.
Mm.
My outcome was always more positive when I was focused on the process. So
Right. And especially when you're focusing on the process like that, you kind of, one
yeah,
of the phrases we use a lot is asking the right questions then about when you have that failure or that miss, it's okay, what do I do now? And,
yeah,
take your example of the high ball, you can really quickly, as soon as that ball hits you in the chest or bounces off your face and goes flying the other direction, you very quickly know what you did wrong because you know
yeah,
your full process leading up to it.
yep, yeah, I agree.
So would you take one of the things I always loved about coaching with your dad and learning that process and the All Blacks process was focusing on the fundamentals and tying that back to also how I operated in the military. Have you brought that into the business? Is that what you mean by the process, creating that process?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the one thing that I've kind of been able to, I'd say, have the advantage of is work in all these different cultures and understand, like, I would say in the Western culture, we're trained a business in a certain way. Like the way we approach situations is a lot different than, say, in an Eastern culture, how they approach business. And so for me, the process was adapting pieces from each culture and finding a middle ground that would give me a little bit of success. I also think that comes down to wanting to carve out a little bit of a niche for myself and be more successful too. Is that I wanted to, I'm a young guy in management, the agriculture industry, in an old industry, and I'm fortunate that I've got a different story which helps me get into a lot of doors. But once I was in there, is how can I provide interest and value to one side, yeah, on both sides, and how do I take experiences from both cultures to put myself in that position.
So where do you go with that? I mean, that positioning. Actually, what I was trying to get at, and I drew a blank on the word, was the cultures. What's the extremes, if you will,
So,
Western culture versus Eastern culture business?
well, I would say that it's the Eastern cultures, the the actual sale is almost like so far off the what how the sales process starts. Yeah, you have to get through this, I would say minefield, but you have to get through their personal evaluation about who they're doing business with. Relationships is almost more important than the product you're selling there, and so I would say that there it was understanding how to work through that situation in a sales environment or with a new customer or a new client is, you know, I always wanted to be like, so when do we talk about the product kind of a thing? So, I've been here for an hour and a half and we're still talking about everything else under the sun. And it's similar to what, if I was speaking to a farmer in the United States, it's very similar. I would draw that analogy. Farmers in the States, they're very much about buying from people, people buy from people. But I think in some of the other distribution environments, people value their, as I wouldn't say they value the time, but time is short. So they're kind of like, get to the point, what are you here for? How's it going to benefit me? The elevator speech, the elevator pitch, essentially. Well, in Eastern culture, it's not an elevator pitch. You're walking through the airport instead of taking the travelator. Everything takes a lot more time to get to there. But there's also advantages. So then, how do you take that, and then how do you apply some of that to an elevator pitch situation? How do you inject something that makes you memorable, because everybody's giving an elevator pitch? So where's the personal connection you can develop in that short amount of time? So I think that's one thing that I took from Eastern culture that helped me perhaps in the US sales environment, is trying to get that personal connection in with a pitch that's on point in terms of what I'm presenting and what will deliver to them.
Yeah, I think that's great because, when you look at it as far as developing a personal connection, that can help a lot in business, even if it's not as big of a value piece. But then when you figure out how to piece that into your quick sales pitch, and it's, I found it's, going door to door with my business here and trying to get people to come on board. And when I was working up in Miami for a little while and giving tours and things, I found that the personal sides of my stories were what got people the most interested. It was just about saying something interesting enough to bring them to the point where you could have the personal aspect. And then that kind of brought everything home, because then they feel like they're a part of something.
Well, and then afterwards, they remember that personal characteristic. At the end of the day, everybody's still selling a product. And the fact that in today's society, your product is going to have a similar product somewhere. The true innovative products, they don't really, they exist a lot less. So what makes you memorable to the guy when you leave and he has to compare your value proposition against everybody else? It could be that one story that you told. Could be, for me, it could be like this crazy New Zealander that came in that I didn't understand a word he was saying the entire time.
But it's memorable, exactly.
Yes, it's memorable. So I do think it's an advantage.
And I think, just to kind of circle it back around to the elevator pitch thing, to give a little bit of advice on this type of thing, it's as simple as just condensing your story down into a couple of sentences of really interesting things and working that in as you introduce yourself before your pitch. Like I can think of one thing I'll say a lot is military brat from Colorado, because that checks a lot of boxes with a lot of people around the country, just as like, oh, military brat, there's a connection for us. And those type of little things that can kind of give you a little bit of something to look back on when you're done talking with them.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I would say when I come into a situation here, I always try and relate it to somewhere. And like, I'll tell a story about Russia at the beginning, or one of our Russian clients, and immediately I have they're intrigued because they don't understand Russia as a market, but they know it's a really large market and they know there's some big players in it. So then immediately I have their interest and then I can talk about it. And then afterwards, what I find out is they say, well, tell me more about Russia. How does it work there? And I think that little bit of, it's something, it's that unknown for them and the willingness to learn about it that, again, makes me memorable in that situation, or a company memorable, not me. Sorry.
And that's a huge expert factor too, as far as their perception of you and your company. Then if you're giving all of this information about something they don't completely understand, that's a huge boost on the expert side of things. Sorry.
And they've probably seen the YouTube videos from Russia too. So that always
the driving ones. They said, if that guy can go to Russia and survive driving for 5 years, then he must be lucky. I want to do business with him.
That's right. Yeah. So what books did you read? Did you go through some courses? Did Dad teach you everything, or did you just learn the school of hard knocks?
So I would say that I'm probably I've read the least amount out of probably anybody that you would have spoken to before. I've never been a big reader. I've tried to, yeah, but I'm the guy that just wants to get to the conclusion. I always want to get to the conclusion. So I've never been a really big reader. I had agriculture forced down my throat from a very young age. So granddad, obviously, well known in agriculture. He had an OBE from the Queen. He did a lot of things, and he got my dad into agriculture. They had a big company in New Zealand, and then dad had a lifetime of agriculture, taking me into every meeting. And so for me, agriculture was the complete opposite of what I wanted to do. So the fact that I've ended up in agriculture is kind of comical, but for me, it was a full circle. So for me, it started, I want in every other industry. And I think intrinsically something inside of me had been bred into the certain relationship aspect of business that happens in agriculture that perhaps doesn't happen. And a little bit, I think there's a little, how do I say this? A little bit more meaning to a lot of things, because, when I sit a guy in the face and I know that, what I'm going to sell him 100% affects his livelihood, as a farmer, and that farmer's livelihood affects the ability for us to feed ourselves, is kind of goes full circle. I think I like that connection. I like the connection and the impact that it has. So that's why I went back towards it. In terms of what helped me, 100%, every one of those meetings that I didn't want to go to as a kid has helped me, and it shaped me somehow. Everything that I didn't like about how dad told me to approach things in business has helped me. And don't let him watch this, but yeah.
I was just going to say, so John, you hear that, right?
Yeah. So, but also, one of the biggest challenges I had, working with my father to begin with, was the fact that I wanted to make my own mistakes. So I acknowledge the fact that he was successful and he did these things, but I also wanted the opportunity to do it. And I would say that perhaps a lot of the stuff that I've learned, while padded heavily by experience that I've just taken on board, like a sponge growing up, I learned myself out there. And so one of the biggest pieces of learning that I think I've found, or the things that's made me successful or somewhat successful to begin with, is the ability to self-drive research. So I'll give you an example. So I'm thinking about placing a new product in the market, and I hear a need. Yeah. So I mine for a need in the market. And then what I do is I go and I educate myself on 6 different subsegments in that market. And I read and read and read. So that reading it's not reading experiences from another businessman that's done it. Like a great friend of mine, John Vandergeesten, who I think is one of the more brilliant businessmen that I've met, and one of the best self-educated guys that I've met, in terms of, he can quote every line from every book out there, motivational book. And he was always sending them to me in the mail. And my opinion was as well, what's this got to do with agriculture? Why do I have to read this book on this guy from something? Or what does this have to do with this? Now, of course, I've now listened and read a few of these books, not as much as I should, but I use different type of education. I like to make myself as close to an expert on a subject as possible without being an expert. So I'll research every one of those subsegments of the market. I'll research my competition inside and out. I'll develop kind of dummy product lines, and then I'll go and put them out, just as soft feedback to people. In conversations, I'm always looking for a need. That's one thing. So it doesn't matter what it is with the customer at the time, whether I'm in there selling them fertilizer, I'm looking for a need to be able to provide value. So whether that need is something that I can provide or I can just facilitate, then it provides value for me. So these are kind of things I kind of work a little bit differently than reading motivational books. So it's probably very confusing, but it wasn't very specific either.
No, that's spot on for what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Is it the hard knocks, or or are you one of those gifted people? Because a lot of people read books, but never apply it, right? Because it's just knowledge, and you read it, it's just knowledge. You got to figure out how to get it off the paper into your head and then into execution. And that's you're just taking a different approach. You're taking the knowledge in from a different media, life experiences, and then applying it.
And I do think now that I'm to the point where self-realization's a lot closer to home. I'm willing to admit that I am deficient in some areas now, and I do find myself now reaching out to people. I love the peer network. I love talking to people. I love firsthand speaking to somebody about their experiences and learning that way. And that's just the way I learn. You know, I was the type of guy that I was a crammer, serial crammer. Yeah. So I could remember everything unbelievably, uncannibly for 48 hours, and then I would just forget it all. So for me, reading wasn't a great thing. That's how I got through college. You know, when I was playing rugby, half my professors hated me because they thought I was entitled as a rugby player, and then half my professors worked with me. And so I was able to graduate school while playing rugby at university, and I only went to probably 5 classes a year. So what it meant for me is I was cramming as much as I possibly could. So I guess I learned how to get into a meeting and be prepared, but how that would transfer afterwards was difficult.
James, what skills from rugby do you think that you use most on a regular basis in the professional world?
I don't know. That's a hard question. So I'm trying to think. I know from what doesn't help me, but what does help me the most is you've got to have the ability to be able to self-motivate yourself to do things. So you have to be able to, there's some situations, and I think of this, it just goes back to everyday life. You wake up in the morning, it's cold, it's snowing outside, you want to exercise. Exercise is a good point, but you don't get out of bed. Well, that's that one little trigger, When you were playing rugby, there's an amount of times you didn't want to do something was because your body didn't feel like it or you're worn out, but you just did it anyway. And you didn't have to do it, but if you didn't do it, there was no chance you could be successful. So, and that didn't happen overnight. That's something that you have to learn through consequence, and it's something that just becomes trained inside of you. And I think that's probably the biggest thing is that little demon that sits on your shoulder when you say, I don't want to do something. And he says, well, maybe, is it going to be that much? That's where I think that's probably the one skill or the one thing from rugby that helps me the most.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Definitely, that's something I think I use a lot. It's really just comes back to being able to push yourself and be able to drive yourself through things. I know for me, and I think this really ties into the way I was with rugby, is because I was never, look how skinny I still am. I was never the gym rat or anything like that. But it was very much, it's like, well, when you were out on that pitch for 2 hours, it was everything you have for it, and that's how I've been able to channel it in a similar type of way to where it's like, okay, yeah, maybe I can't get myself constantly working, but I know I can put my head down for 2 hours and do a lot more than folks could do in 4. And I think that's something I took from rugby in a similar type of way.
Yeah, and another thing from rugby, the other thing about is the thrill of the pressure to perform. Yeah, so I loved being in front of a crowd. So I like being put in pressure situations, and that's probably one thing that you need to be able to. I had a huge amount of pressure situations put on me in a short space of time when I was an athlete. So I kind of learned how to adapt to pressure, and I enjoy challenge. I enjoy pressure. Even today was one of the hardest days for us as a business in the last few years. And, my mind was going 100 miles an hour today in a positive direction. Yeah. I wasn't shutting down. I think of pressure. I look at pressure differently.
So what are you doing in the game now? I know you're still involved. So what else are you doing with rugby?
As much as I can get away with, that my wife will let me do. So, having a kid the last couple of years has put a strain on the time. But I like to stay connected to the game. I took over the coaching role here for the Kansas City Blues when I moved out here about 2 years ago now. And so we've had some success. It's been great. So I really like the Blues as a club. They've got a fantastic old boys network. They're a terrific club in terms of organization. We're not gifted with a lot of universities to pull out of, so there's good culture there. We're in a period of rugby, great transition of rugby in the States with all the exciting things that are happening with Major League Rugby, but it's kind of changing the way men's club rugby looks and how it functions. And it's becoming a little bit difficult, and I think the Blues do a good job of navigating that. We went. My first season, I think we went 4-5, and then we went 6-4, and then we went this last spring. We basically won our division for the first time in a long time. We went 12-1. So that was a really good season for us. So that I'm really happy to be part of that. I love coaching. It's something that I just, if I could do, full time, I probably would, but I can't do it. So, as you can probably hear in the background, one of the reasons why. So, yeah. Yeah.
So what else? You're broadcasting too, aren't you?
Yep. That's I really enjoy that. So I've been started doing it here and there a few years ago, and the spring I take off from coaching completely and focus on broadcasting. I love it. I think as a player, I would say more analytical, but I looked at the game differently, and so I love to be able to connect to the game like that, and I like to be able to share my experiences, or knowledge of being able to how to interpret the game and then allow that to benefit the viewer at home. So that's something I really enjoy. I've been doing some of the Major League Rugby games this year. Unfortunately, with the season being cut short, there are not going to be too many opportunities going forward now, but that's definitely one of my favorite things to do.
What's the common thread between the three? If you talk coaching a men's club, doing broadcasting, and then agricultural business.
Common thread between the three. I don't know. I guess, you know what? I would say that the culture in rugby is very similar to the culture in agriculture. Agriculture, just a lot of culture in that sentence. But you'd be surprised at how in agriculture you kind of have that. It's a really hard thing to explain. That kind of that rugby mindset, or that team. It's not a team mindset. How do I put it the right way?
I think I could try to help you on it, James. I'd almost say, because for me, it's the same kind of thing that I felt with what I do now, and then with playing rugby, is almost like a sense of service, where like, especially engine room guy for the forwards, it's like, well, why am I hitting this ruck? It's like, well, so that James could go score tries on the wing. It's always about just doing something for someone else. And I think that's kind of the same type of culture you get inside agriculture.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. So that's exactly the way I put it. So I love the fact that I'm a small piece in the cog, that feeds America. And so, I have a huge, personally, being so close to agriculture in the US and seeing things, I think it's troubling. The future of agriculture in the US is troubling. I think the way that we're moving and we're approaching the system of food in the States is flawed. And I really feel strongly about trying to make it more productive for farmers, more profitable for farmers, because it's a tough business to be a farmer at the moment in the United States. And so I really, I feel strongly that, that team thing that you're talking about, I'm a cog in the wheel that allows an outcome.
Where do you see, and this is a broad one, so I just hit it a little bit, I guess, but where do you see that growth in agriculture in the near future to address those type of problems, whether technologically or otherwise?
So I think we're at a bit of a turning point in agriculture. So if you look at the age of the population in the United States, so it's generally farmers are getting older, which means they're becoming more corporate farms, which is a good thing because economies of scale allow them to produce profits. But I think in general at the moment, a lot of the focus is driven by where perception of agriculture is. I think we've got ourselves into a situation now where we're so far removed from the general public in the United States understanding where their food comes from, that there's a real problem there, because they don't understand. They're not absorbent to price changes. They're not educated on products. I think the organic industry in the States, while started originally, was a good thing. I think if someone actually educates themselves on organic production, is it better for agriculture in the US? Is it better for the individual? I think there's a number of areas, but we could talk about that for hours. I'm pretty passionate about that one.
Well, I think one thing you kind of touched on there, which is something I picked up early on in agriculture, was there's a little bit of a need in the public to know your farmer and that type of thing. And I've worked with places where you have that, and it's a very different relationship. And that, for some people it doesn't matter at all. They'll go to the grocery store, they don't care. But there's a lot of people out there who kind of have that idea of, because they don't understand the process and things, they want to know who's growing their food. They want to try to build more of those, like you were saying, for the Eastern culture, the more personal relationships that way.
Yeah, and I think it's something we're unbelievable today that we're great self-educators. Yeah, when it benefits us, you ask someone to ask them what the newest features on an iPhone coming out, they'll recite everything that's coming out for it. but you ask them to, anything about their food, which is funny because in terms of pure necessity for a human being, food's number one. But it's something that we don't educate ourselves enough on because it's always been there. It's always been a given that we're going to have food.
So would a solution then be adding some sort of agricultural training and education into our school systems then?
Yeah, there's a great initiative from the industry to really focus on this and do this. I think, if you look at one of the bigger problems of food supply in the States, it's the fact that centralized food supply really doesn't exist, where, we import food from all over the world and distribute in supermarkets because we need the lowest cost product there. We want food that's not seasonally available year round. So we bring it in. So we can't have a relationship with our grower. The safest thing I always say to somebody, and I love supermarket debates. So I'm the guy that, ladies there, it's like, she'll be there and she's like, excuse me, do you have any, non-GMO this, tomatoes? And I said, excuse me, ma'am, like, to be honest, like, there wouldn't be tomatoes if there wasn't GMO. There wouldn't be broccoli if there wasn't GMO or plant breeding. So we have all these things because of the media. We have this anti-corporate sentiment in agriculture against big corporations, which means that down the line, we're skewed in our opinions on what food is, what modifications exist, how food's growing. So I think that's definitely a problem.
I think that's a great point, because this is something I've gotten into where, as a farmer, you have to sell to both sides of the crowd. It was a lot of the time where it's like, we would do some things are very organic, but we were using a fertilizer that wasn't, and those type of things.
Yeah.
But it's like, as long as you're able to talk people through the process, because most people, like you're saying, is they don't really understand what that means. I have a good friend, and I won't name drop the farm because I don't want to get him in any trouble, because I don't think I was supposed to get this tour there. But he broke down to me their organic versus non-organic production. And for organic, it was let's call it a 20% mixture that they were allowed to put out there every 2 weeks. The non-organic was a 40% mixture they put out there every 4 weeks. Same stuff, same active ingredient. And it was just one of those, it's like, there's really no difference here. And it's not to say, like you were saying, that there's not a real, whether it's a need or the more humble origins, I guess is kind of the best way to put it, of where it is well intentioned, but where it's become to the point where it's like you're using the same amount of the active ingredient but using it differently because that makes it organic. This is why people just don't understand that process a lot, and it takes that educational aspect.
Well, and you need to have a relationship. The safest, I always say to people, the safest way is it's not organics, it's not any of this stuff. It's having a relationship with the person that grows your food. If you do that and you trust them, they're going to make decisions that are best for you. And to be honest, even in mainstream agriculture, if you look at things that exist in agriculture for food safety, there's more food safety around conventional production than there is organic production in the States in terms of what's safer to eat. So, but you don't know this. It's marketing. Marketing drives the world, yeah? So right now, marketing's it for agriculture, and it's ultimately good for agriculture, but it's not from the standpoint that it's shifting the profit center away from where it matters. The profit center needs to be with the farmers. The profit centers now become with the marketers, yeah? The grass-fed beef trend and all of these marketing terminology that gains the premium that doesn't provide the farmer the premium. So that's...
Where you've done a lot of work in Eastern Europe. Now I'm curious if you had any experience in Asia, because really what my question is where's the best, most efficient farming system?
Oh, well, I've done some work in Southeast Asia as well, in Korea. They're efficient because they got not a lot of land. Yeah, the size of the farms are small, but they're inefficient in terms of labor because labor is very cheap. So the most efficient places is whereas labor is expensive, farms are large because you've got to be as efficient as possible, because you can't burn diesel. Anytime you burn diesel, you lose profits. So you look at large scale farming, and so there's parts in the States that are unbelievably efficient. And I think the US is definitely the leader in terms of efficiency in agriculture from a number of standpoints. And it's interesting because we all poo-poo the States environmentally, but that efficiency driven through profit and necessity actually makes us one of the most environmentally friendly producers in the world as well. People don't think it, but you know, if you look at a farm overseas that's small and inefficient, they've got 5 tractors running, they're over fertilizing, they're doing all these things. Those are bad for the environment. But you take a farmer here, amazing. Go to Southwest Kansas tomorrow and you'll meet a farmer. He farms 6,000 acres with him, his wife, and occasional labor comes in. That's just mind boggling to think about the scale of production he can do with a couple of tractors. And so he has to be as efficient as possible on every acre he has. And efficiency drives environmental friendliness and drives profits, everything. So
And
I would say America.
that reminds me of something from a class, and I'm not even going to try to say what the name of the class was, but it was an economics, philosophy, one of the politics type class. Kind of touched on a lot of different things. And one of the arguments that they got that I found very interesting is kind of something you're saying when they're talking things like tragedy of the commons, that type of stuff. They talk about how one of the best things you can do for sustainability and efficiency is to have people own their own land. Because when you have that piece of land and that land is your livelihood and that's it, that's all you have to be efficient with it, just like you're saying. And that efficiency drives the sustainability down the road.
Yeah, I agree.
That's something I hadn't thought of, but it makes sense, you know, because if you have limited, if you're worried about your bottom line, you're not going to over fertilize, because you know that just by putting another extra 10% of fertilizer or whatever additive, it's not going to equate to that extra 10% profit. It doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
That's a new one for me, which brings me to my favorite part of the show. So it's the what you learn, and you know, my list continues to grow, but I get tired of writing most of the time. But it was that aspect, the common thread of how in rugby and in business you use those common goals that really help drive. Because, and actually with a lot of businesses I've worked with, that's one of the things they're missing. So it's a great trait that you've brought over from playing sport into business, because a lot of businesses just don't have that. So thanks for reiterating that. Camden, what'd you learn?
Kind of touched on the Eastern and Western culture side of things, because I think that's a very interesting area, because you can learn so much from different places and, you know, take the best of different operations and add it in to make something different. And then how you can add that into your own business that you can differentiate yourself. But the bigger piece of that and the more specific aspect of it was the inserting personal aspects about yourself and personal anecdotes and stories into your elevator pitch, so that you're able to create a more personal business and much more memorable conversation.
So James, what'd you learn? And since we didn't do any reading, I expect you probably learned a lot during the show.
Unbelievable. It's 3 times as much as I would have been trying to turn the pages. Actually, in being able to talk and dig in about what you think that you've maybe learned from another sport, I learned that I probably should sit down and I should probably, look at a few different examples from a different way and maybe apply it, think about it how I would have thought about it in sport. It's been a few years, obviously, since I played. So I think that we'd find a lot more similarities between what happens in the sports environment, what happens in the business world. And if I just thought about a problem, like I would think about it as a challenge in rugby, then I might come out with a different outcome.
That's funny you say that. Sometimes things hit close to home. I was just talking with a guy earlier this afternoon about that same thing, but from the military side. He's like, well, why not approach it as you would a mission? I'm like, why didn't I approach it like a mission?
Yeah.
So that's great. And I appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, I mean, obviously we're not going to hear you doing any MLR games anytime soon for at least 30 days. I'm going to tell you here, probably another 45. We're lucky. But if anybody wants to get in contact with you or learn more about agrotech, how can they find you?
Yeah, so you can easily find me. I'm on LinkedIn as well, but our company, we've got a website, agrotechusa.com. And then, I'd be happy to pass on the link to my email, but, happy to talk to anybody about it. And, I would say one thing, if you're listening and you're interested in agriculture, it may be the least sexy industry on the planet, but I can tell you there's more opportunity in agriculture than a lot of other industries. And it's a really good transition from the sporting world to come into agriculture. I feel like it's a natural fit. I feel like it's an easy transition into it. And, you know, I encourage anybody that is thinking about a career profession to go into agriculture, or think about it at least. So.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate your time this afternoon. And, well, I know you got a lot of it right now, but no, it's great to have you on, and thanks for sharing those thoughts and understanding with us.
No, thanks for having me. It's awesome. Always awesome to talk to you guys.
Great catching up with you, James.